The sky above Velthura Prime had not been blue for 6 days. It was gray now, thick with smoke and the broken light of orbital fires burning somewhere far above the clouds. The people on the surface could not see the ships fighting up there, but they could feel the tremors. Every few hours, something heavy would shake the ground, and the children would cry, and the elders would go quiet in a way that was worse than crying. The Velthari were not a warrior people. They had long, slender fingers built for music and craft. Their cities were full of open gardens and tall windows. They had spent 300 years building a confederacy with 4 other species, not through war, but through patience, trade, and careful diplomacy. They were proud of that. They had always believed that talking was stronger than fighting, but the Korath did not talk. The Korath Dominion came from the far edge of the galactic arm, and they came with purpose. Their ships were dark and angular, like blades floating in space. Their commanders gave ultimatums, not conversations. Their soldiers did not negotiate. Planet after planet in the Confederacy had already fallen not to discussion, but to fire. Now it was Velthura Prime's turn. Inside the great underground bunker beneath the capital city, the Velthari High Council sat around a long stone table. Their faces were tired. Their robes, usually neat and ceremonial, were wrinkled and dusty. The lights overhead flickered every time a tremor hit. High Counselor Dravan looked at the map on the wall. Red markers covered at lost systems, fallen worlds, destroyed stations. There were very few blue markers left. He had stopped counting the red ones 2 days ago because it made it hard to breathe. "We have tried everyone," said Counselor Maevi, her voice flat and dry. She was the head of foreign relations. She had spent the last 3 weeks making calls to every major power in the known galaxy. The Silhari Collective says they cannot risk conflict with the Dominion. The Dren Republics have sealed their borders. The Omakai Hegemony sent their sympathy and nothing else. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Ambassador Thesavara spoke. She was younger than most of the council, with large gray eyes that always looked like they were thinking about something difficult. She had spent 7 years working in the outer diplomatic stations. She had met many species, including humans. "There is one more option," she said carefully. "We have not contacted Earth." Several counselors looked at her. A few looked confused. One old counselor, Brevin, actually let out a short, tired laugh. "Humans," he said. "They are kind people, good traders, good doctors. But their fleet is small. Everyone knows this. They have perhaps 200 escort ships. What would they do against the Korath Grand Fleet?" "They would try," Thesavara said simply. "And they would bring supplies, medical ships, convoy escorts. It may not stop the Dominion, but it would save lives on the ground. It would give our people hope." Dravan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Send the signal. Ask for humanitarian aid. Ask for medical support and convoy protection." He paused. "Be honest with them. Tell them what we are facing. But do not ask for war. We cannot drag a small nation into this. It would not be right." Thesavara nodded and left the room. She composed the message herself, sitting in a cold side chamber with a single lamp and a half-empty cup of tea gone cold beside her. She wrote it plainly. No formal language, no political softening. She told the humans about the falling worlds. She told them about the fires in the sky. She told them about the children on the surface who had not slept properly in a week. She asked for help in the same way a person asks a neighbor honestly, and without pretending the situation was smaller than it was. She sent it. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling, and tried not to think about whether it would matter. The message arrived at the Human Interstellar Diplomatic Mission on a Thursday morning, which was relevant only because Director Callan Morse had been in the middle of approving a routine cargo manifest when it came through. He set the manifest aside. He read the Velthari message once. Then he read it again more slowly. Morse was not a dramatic man. He was 53 years old, with gray at his temples, and a habit of keeping his desk very clean. He had spent 20 years in interstellar diplomacy, and before that he had studied history, specifically the history of wars, and what caused them, and what happened to people who were not ready when they came. He understood the message completely. He understood what the Velthari were asking for. He also understood what they did not know to ask for, because they did not know what humanity had. Nobody did. That was the point. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and looked out at the city for a moment. The lights, the traffic far below, the pale curve of the moon visible through thin afternoon cloud. Then he turned around, picked up the secure comm unit from its locked drawer, and entered a 14-digit code that he had memorized years ago and never expected to use. The line opened. "This is Director Morse," he said. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "Authentication code, 7 November, 04 Cascade. I am formally requesting activation of the Armada protocols." There was a brief pause on the other end. Not surprised, the people on the other end had been waiting for this call for a very long time. Just the sound of careful process. "Confirmed, Director. Armada protocols activated. Standing by for targeting authorization. The Velthari Confederacy," Morse said. "Specifically, Velthara Prime, and all surrounding systems currently under Korath occupation. Full humanitarian and combat deployment." "Understood. Estimated assembly time, 9 days. Make it 8, Morse said. Then he added, almost to himself, "They've been burning long enough." He ended the call. He set the comm unit on the desk. He sat back down in his chair and picked up his cold coffee and looked at the Velthari message, still open on his screen, at Thesavara's honest, careful words. At the image she had attached of the smoke-gray sky above Velthara Prime. He thought about the Korath Grand Admiral reading the response Earth was about to send. He thought about the expression on that Admiral's face when he realized that what was coming was not a few supply ships and some kind doctors. For just a moment, something flickered across Morse's face that might have been in another man, a smile. Then he picked up his regular comm and called his assistant. "Clear my calendar for the next 3 weeks," he said. "And get me a line to Admiral Osei." The Luna shipyards did not appear on any public map. That was not an accident. From the surface of Earth's moon, the yards looked like nothing, just dark rock and old craters. The same gray nothing that covered most of the lunar surface. But underneath, carved into the stone over the course of 60 years, were tunnels wide enough to fly a warship through. And in those tunnels, row after row, like sleeping giants waiting for someone to wake them up, sat the ships of the First Terran Armada. Admiral Yara Osei stood on the command bridge of the T's Endurance and looked out through the forward viewport at the tunnel ahead of her. The lights along the walls were coming on one by one as power ran through the system for the first time in 2 years. Around her, her crew moved quickly and quietly, running checks, reading screens, speaking in low voices into headsets. They had trained for this. They had been training for this, in some form, their entire careers. Osei was 51 years old, and she had never fired a weapon in actual combat. She had spent her life preparing for a war she hoped would never happen. That was, she had always thought, the best kind of soldier. One who trains so completely that the war becomes unnecessary. But she had also been a student of history, and history had a way of reminding you that hope was not the same as a plan. The Armada protocols changed everything. When Morse's call came through, it traveled along a secure channel that linked Earth Command to 18 separate staging sites across human space. In less than 1 hour, 4,200 warships began to wake up. Not 200. Not 500. 4,200. The galaxy thought it knew what humanity had. They had seen the public fleet, the 200 escort ships, the handful of diplomatic cruisers, the small patrol vessels that orbited human colonies. Those were real ships, doing real work. But they were also, in the quiet language of military strategy, a performance, a carefully maintained impression of a nation that was helpful and friendly and not particularly dangerous. The Armada was what lay behind that impression. Humanity had started building it nearly 140 years ago, not long after they first made contact with the wider galactic community. The decision had not been made in anger or fear, exactly. It had been made by people who paid close attention. They had watched how the galaxy worked, how small nations got absorbed or destroyed, how diplomatic agreements fell apart when one side was powerful enough to ignore them, how the strong always seemed to find reasons why protecting the weak was someone else's problem. Humans had a long memory for that kind of thing. Their own history was full of it. So they built. Quietly, over generations, they built. The ships of the Armada were different from anything else in the known galaxy. Most interstellar civilizations designed their warships around a philosophy of deterrence, make the ship look powerful enough that no one would want to fight it. Terran ships were designed around a different philosophy entirely. They were built to win. There was nothing decorative about them. They were dense, heavily armored, and fast in a way that did not make sense until you understood that humans had spent decades specifically redesigning their propulsion systems for combat acceleration. The weapons were also different. Where most galactic weapon systems were designed to destroy, Terran weapons were designed to control, to disable precisely, to stop a ship without necessarily killing everyone on it. That choice said something about the people who built them, though most of the galaxy would never think to look at it that way. Osei walked the length of the Endurance's main hangar as the fighter wings were being powered up. The pilots moved around their ships in the steady, purposeful way of people who had done this 1,000 times in drills and were now doing it for real. A few of them looked up when she passed. She nodded at them. They nodded back. She stopped at the hangar window and looked out at the tunnel beyond, where 3 other dreadnoughts were slowly coming to life in the dark. Their running lights came on one at a time, like stars being lit from the inside. She had seen this in drills, seen the simulations, read every technical report about what the Armada was capable of. But seeing it fully awake, really awake, not just powered for a maintenance check, was still something that made her stand still for a moment. 4,000 ships, each one crewed by people who had signed up knowing what they were for. Not for conquest, not for empire. For exactly this, for the moment when someone called and everyone else had already said no. Her first officer, Commander Dev Rajan, appeared at her shoulder. Staging complete across all 18 sites, he said. All ships report ready. We are awaiting your order to form up. Osei looked at the ships in the tunnel for another moment. She thought about the message Director Morse had forwarded to her Thesavara's words, the image of the gray, smoke-covered sky. She thought about all the years of training, all the quiet decades of building something that she had hoped the galaxy would never require proof of. She thought about Velthara Prime, and the children on the ground who had not slept. Send the formation order, she said. All Armada elements fall in on the Endurance. We form the main column in 6 hours and jump in 8. Understood, Admiral. Rajan paused. For what it's worth, the crew is ready. Genuinely ready. I know, Osei said. That's the only reason I'm not scared. She turned from the window and walked back toward the bridge. Behind her, through the viewport, the tunnel was filling up with light as the great ships of the first Terran Armada powered up together for the very first time. 4,200 engines, 4,200 hulls, 4,200 crews, who had spent their lives waiting for a mission that actually mattered. They had been patient. They had been quiet. They had been careful and polite, and easy to underestimate. That time was over now. Grand Admiral Vorath had a habit of standing with his hands behind his back when he was winning. He was standing that way now, on the command deck of his flagship, the Crimson Verdict, looking out at the planet below. Velthara Prime was a green and blue world, or it had been, once. Now great patches of it were brown and gray, where the surface bombardments had touched. The planet's orbital defense grid had been destroyed in the first 2 days. The Confederacy fleet, what was left of it, had scattered 3 days after that. Now only the surface remained, full of frightened people and a council hiding underground, pretending they still had options. Vorath did not hate the Velthari. He had no feelings about them at all. They were simply the next item on a very long list. The Korath Dominion had been expanding for 40 years. Planet by planet, system by system, always moving outward, always adding. Vorath had led campaigns on 11 worlds. He had never lost. He had learned, over those years, that the most important part of conquest was not firepower, it was certainty. You had to make the enemy believe that resistance was not just dangerous, but pointless. Once they believed that, they stopped fighting. The rest was just administration. Velthara Prime was almost at that point. He could feel it. His communications officer looked up from his station. Admiral, we've received a transmission. It's a formal declaration of armed intervention. He paused. From Earth. Several officers on the bridge turned their heads. Vorath did not turn. Earth, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Humans, sir. It's co-signed by their 12 colony worlds and 3 allied species. The officer hesitated. They are declaring formal military intervention in the Velthari conflict. Vorath finally turned. He looked at his officer for a moment. Then he did something he rarely did during operations. He smiled. The humans. He had encountered them twice at diplomatic functions. Years ago. Pleasant people always bringing food to share. Always asking questions about other cultures. Always smiling in that slightly too friendly way they had. Their fleet was common knowledge. 200 ships, maybe a little more. Escort class. Diplomatic runners. The kind of fleet a nation built when it wanted to look like it had a fleet, without actually having to use one. Send them a response, Vorath said, still almost amused. Tell them this system is under active military operation. Tell them their supply ships and aid workers are not welcome here. Tell them to go home. He turned back to the viewport. 3 minutes later, his tactical officer spoke in a very different voice. Admiral, I'm reading. Spatial distortion. Hyperspace rupture signatures. One of ours coming back early? No, sir. There are multiple. Very multiple. A pause. I'm reading 40 ruptures. 60. 100. Vorath turned slowly. The tactical display on the main screen was filling up with contact markers. Blue dots, unknown vessels appearing in clusters across the entire engagement zone. Not just in front of them. On all sides. Above and below the orbital plane. Spread across the system in a pattern that was clearly not accidental. Clearly not rushed. It was a formation. A massive, deliberate, perfectly coordinated formation that had been planned well in advance. The number on the screen kept climbing. 200. 500. 1,000. The bridge had gone very quiet. Every officer was watching the screen. Some of them had stopped what they were doing entirely and were just staring. 2,000. 3,000. Sir, the tactical officer said, and his voice had changed completely, the professional flatness gone. Something smaller and more honest in its place. I'm reading 4,200 vessels. Human registry. All warships. He swallowed. They outnumber us 7-1. Vorath stood completely still. The human ships were big. Bigger than the tactical scans had suggested. They would be bigger than any intelligence report had ever mentioned, because no intelligence report had ever seen them. They were dark, hulled, and dense, their running lights burning cold white in the dark of space. They held their formation without drifting, without shuffling, like they had done this 100 times and found it easy. Down on the surface of Velthara Prime, in the underground bunker, Ambassador Thesivara was standing in front of the tactical display, with both hands pressed flat on the table. She was reading the same contact numbers. Her aide had stopped talking mid-sentence and was staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. 4,200 ships. Human ships. Here. She had asked for convoy escorts and medical supplies. She felt something rise in her chest that she did not have a word for at first, and then she recognized it, distantly, like something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Enormous, terrifying, completely unexpected hope. Her eyes were wet. She did not notice until one of the drops hit the back of her hand. Back in orbit, a single communication opened across all frequencies. Velthari, Korath, and open channel both. A human voice came through. A woman's voice, calm and even. This is Admiral Yara Osei, of the 1st Terran Armada, speaking on behalf of the United Earth Government and all allied signatories of the Velthara Intervention Declaration. Grand Admiral Vorath, you are ordered to cease all hostile operations and begin withdrawing your fleet from this system immediately. All Korath vessels are to stand down weapons and power down targeting systems within the next 4 minutes. We will not fire unless fired upon. You have 4 minutes. I will not be asking twice. The channel closed. The bridge of the Crimson Verdict was silent. One of Vorath's senior officers, a man who had served with him for 11 years, turned and looked at him with an expression Vorath had never seen on that face before. It was not panic. It was something more honest than panic. Sir, the officer said quietly, what do we do? Vorath looked at the tactical display. He looked at the 4,200 white contacts surrounding his 600 ships on every side. He looked at the human vessels, holding their formation, weapons hot, waiting. He had spent 40 years making enemies believe resistance was pointless. He understood, in that moment, what it felt like to believe it. He said nothing. He stood with his hands behind his back, and he looked at the screen, and somewhere deep in the machinery of his certainty, something very old and very heavy began, for the first time, to crack. Vorath gave the order to fight at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Not because he believed he could win. He had looked at the numbers. He understood the numbers. But Vorath had built his entire life on the idea that the Koreth did not back down, that the Dominion's power came from its reputation, and that a reputation built over 40 years could not simply be handed over at the demand of a species nobody had taken seriously until 11 minutes ago. So, he gave the order. And 4 minutes after Admiral Osei closed the channel, 600 Koreth warships opened fire on the first Terran Armada. What happened next would be studied and argued about in military academies across the galaxy for the next 100 years. Lieutenant Cass Marin was 24 years old and had been flying fighters for 3 years. She had 300 hours of combat simulation and exactly 0 hours of real combat. She had always assumed that when the real thing came, she would be scared. She was not scared. She was focused in a way she had never felt before, a kind of cool, clean clarity that turned everything into shapes and angles and timing. Her fighter was one of 64 launched from the carrier T's Resolute in the first wave, spreading out in a formation that her squadron called the Fan-Wide, fast, designed to approach Koreth flanks from multiple angles simultaneously. The Koreth ships fired at them. They fired well. The Koreth were not bad fighters. Marin could see that clearly. Their targeting was fast and their gunners were disciplined. But they were used to fighting enemies who responded to fire by either retreating or charging directly back. The human fighters did neither. They curved. They split. They broke formation just long enough to be impossible to track, then reformed at a different point entirely. "On your left, Cass?" said her wingman, Petrov, his voice easy in her earpiece. She was already moving left. She had seen it too. 3 Koreth cruisers had formed a blocking line to protect the flagship. Standard defensive tactic. Every military manual in the galaxy said you met a blocking line by either going around it or hitting it hard enough to break it. Marin's squadron did neither. They slowed down against every instinct and pulled up just enough to come in high and steep, from an angle the cruiser's gun arcs were not optimized to cover. She released her payload at exactly the right moment and pulled away clean, and the cruiser's engine section went dark without the hull breaking apart. Disabled. Not destroyed. That was the instruction. Disable when possible. The humans had discussed this for years during planning. A dead crew was a tragedy that served no purpose. A disabled ship was a message. Aboard the Koreth tactical vessel Unbroken Spear, Senior Weapons Officer Greth had stopped trying to understand what he was seeing and was simply trying to keep up with it. The human dreadnoughts were doing something his tactical computer could not properly model. They were moving in groups, not charging, not holding, but doing small, precise jumps inside the system, appearing at different points in the engagement zone every few minutes. Each time they jumped, the position made no immediate sense. Then, 30 seconds later, it did, because the ships that had been trying to flank them were suddenly the ones being flanked, surrounded, or cut off from the rest of the Koreth formation. They were not reacting to the battle. They were running a plan they had already built before the first shot was fired. Greth tried to target the nearest dreadnought. His weapons locked. He fired a full spread, the kind of spread that had shattered hulls on 11 other worlds. The rounds hit. He watched them hit. But the dreadnought did not break. Its hull seemed to absorb the impacts and distribute them, spreading the damage in a way his targeting computer could not calculate. The ship kept moving. Its weapons returned fire precisely, targeting only Greth's vessel's propulsion array. The Unbroken Spear went dark from the engines up. They drifted, helpless. Greth sat back in his chair. In 11 years of service, no enemy had ever made him feel like he was the one who did not understand what was happening. He felt it now, clearly and completely. He pressed the emergency broadcast button. Nothing came back. The comm relay network was already down, cut off hours ago, before the battle even started, by human stealth assets that had been in position long before the Armada arrived. There was no reaching the Dominion. There was no calling for help. There was just the battle, and the growing silence of Korath ships going dark one by one. On the surface of Velthera Prime, a young soldier named Edris had climbed to the roof of the bunker's outer stairwell, technically against orders, but the officers had stopped enforcing small rules about 2 days ago. He had a pair of old optical telescopes that his grandfather had given him, and he had been watching the sky every night, trying to understand what was happening. Tonight the sky was full of light. Not the terrible orange light of bombardment. Different light, white and cold, moving in fast arcs, exploding in distant silent bursts that felt clean somehow, purposeful. He tracked one group of lights that moved in a curve across the darkness, and then split apart and came together again from a different direction. And he watched it happen again and again with different groups, until he understood, in a rough and wordless way, what he was seeing. They were not fighting wildly. They were not even fighting angrily. They were solving something, moving pieces on a board with a patience and precision that felt almost quiet, despite the scale of it. He lowered his telescope. He turned to the soldier standing next to him. "They don't fight like soldiers," he said. The other soldier looked at him. "They fight like they're fixing something," Edris said. "Like this is a problem, and they already know the answer." The Battle of Velthara Prime lasted 2 hours and 51 minutes. At the end of it, the Korath Grand Fleet, 600 ships, the most powerful single military force the Dominion had ever assembled in one place, was finished. 112 ships had been destroyed outright, most of them because they refused to stand down, even after being crippled. 419 were disabled and drifting. The remaining 69 had fled the system, scattering in multiple directions. Terran losses: 9 ships destroyed, 2 heavily damaged. Vorath's flagship still floated at the center of the debris field, its engines dead, its weapons offline. It was intact, deliberately intact. Admiral Osei had given specific orders. The Crimson Verdict was not to be destroyed. She opened a direct channel to the flagship. Vorath appeared on screen. His uniform was still neat. His expression was controlled, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. A hollowness, where the certainty used to live. Osei looked at him for a moment. She was holding a mug of tea in one hand. She looked less like a conqueror, and more like someone who had just finished a very long shift and was tired but satisfied. "Grand Admiral," she said, "a medical team from the T's Mercy will be docking with your vessel in approximately 20 minutes. Your wounded will be treated before anything else happens. That is not a negotiation, it is simply what we do." She paused. "After that, we'll talk about next steps. I expect your cooperation, and I imagine you will give it, because you are a practical man." Vorath stared at her. He had prepared himself for gloating, for demands, for the kind of behavior that winners usually showed. Instead, he was being told that his wounded would be treated first. He did not know what to do with that. "Why?" he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Osei considered the question seriously. "Because they're hurt," she said. "And we can help. That's the whole reason." She closed the channel. The smoke began to clear on the 8th day. Not all at once, it never clears all at once. It thinned slowly, the gray pulling back from the edges first, letting through pale blue in long strips that widened hour by hour. People came out of the shelters when the blue came back. They stood in the streets and looked up, not saying much, just breathing air that didn't smell like burning anymore. The first human ships landed in the wide-open fields outside the capital. Not warships, those stayed in orbit, quiet and still, holding position like they intended to stay for a while. The ships that landed were white, marked with the green stripe of the Terran Medical Corps. Before the ramps were even fully down, people were moving out of them carrying cases and folded equipment and bags of supplies. They set up in the fields. They set up in the streets. They set up in the schools and the community halls, and anywhere that had a roof and enough floor space. They did not wait to be invited. Ambassador Thesavara walked through the capital on the 9th morning. and what she saw made her stop every few minutes to stand still and simply watch. A human doctor crouched beside a Velthari child, talking slowly and clearly, and making her laugh despite the bandage on her arm. A group of human engineers working alongside Velthari workers on a broken water line, nobody worrying about who was in charge, just getting the pipe fixed. Boxes of food being unloaded and distributed by human and Velthari hands working together without discussion, because the work was obvious, and the need was obvious, and that was enough. She had asked for help. She had not known what help actually looked like, not at this scale, not with this speed. She met Director Morse on the morning of the 10th day. He had come down from the diplomatic ship personally, which surprised her. She had expected to deal with junior staff for at least the first few weeks. Instead, here he was, walking through a temporary aid station in an old market building, looking at clipboards and asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. He was not what she had expected. He was quiet and ordinary looking, the kind of person you could stand next to for 10 minutes without noticing him. But when she introduced herself, he turned to her with full attention, the way some people do, like the rest of the world had paused while you were talking to them. "Ambassador Thesivara," he said, shaking her hand. "I read your message several times. You wrote it very honestly. I was desperate," she said. "I know," he said. That's what made it easy to take seriously. They walked together through the market building, past rows of cots and medical stations. She had been thinking about a question for 9 days, and she decided to ask it now. "Your fleet," she said. No one knew. Not one intelligence network in the Confederacy had any idea of its real size. "How did you hide 4,000 ships for so long?" Morse was quiet for a moment. "We didn't hide them exactly," he said. "We just built them in places no one thought to look. And we never talked about it." That was the harder part, the not talking about it. There were people who wanted to announce it, to use it as deterrence. But we decided that if the galaxy knew what we had, it would change everything. How they dealt with us. How they thought about us. We wanted to be known as neighbors first. The fleet was always meant to be the last resort, not the introduction. Thesivara thought about that. "Were you not afraid?" she said. "That you would need it before you were ready? That someone would come for you first?" "Every year," Morse said simply. "But fear isn't the same as unreadiness. We were afraid, and we kept building anyway." On the other side of the galaxy, the Korath Dominion was doing something it had never done before. It was arguing with itself. The news of Velthara Prime had traveled faster than the fleeing ships. By the time the 69 surviving Korath vessels reached friendly space, the story was already ahead of them. The numbers, the speed, the outcome. 600 ships, 2 hours and 51 minutes, 9 human losses. The Dominion's ruling council held emergency sessions that went on for days. There were factions who called for immediate rearmament and total war against humanity. There were other factions who pointed out, very carefully, that humans had not followed up their victory at Velthara Prime with any advance into Korath space. The Armada sat where it was above the Confederacy worlds, clearly visible on every long-range scanner, making no aggressive moves. It was not threatening. It was simply there, enormous and calm and impossible to misread. It said, without any words, "We know where you are. We know what you are. Try it again if you want to find out what comes next." The aggressive faction lost the argument. Not dramatically. Not with speeches. They lost it because the numbers did not support them. And in the end, numbers were a language even the Korath understood. The occupied Confederacy worlds were returned over the following 3 months. Not all at once, and not without complications and negotiations that tested everyone's patience. But they were returned. One by one, the Korath withdrew, and one by one, the flags came back up, and the people came home to streets that needed a lot of work. Human engineering teams were already there, on most of them, doing the work. Admiral Osei gave one address to the full Armada before they began the long rotation home ships, cycling out in waves. The presence maintained, but the crews getting rest, getting back to their families, getting to be something other than soldiers for a while. She recorded it on the bridge of the Endurance, standing in front of the viewport with Velthara Prime, still visible behind her, mostly blue again now. You did something that has never been done before, she told them. Not because you were the strongest force ever assembled, though you were. Not because you fought perfectly, though you came close. You did something remarkable because of why you came. You came because someone asked. Because someone wrote an honest letter about people in trouble, and we decided that was enough of a reason. She paused. We built this armada so that no one would ever have to watch their world burn, while waiting for help that never came. Today, it meant exactly that. Let's make sure that every day, it means that. And let's make sure we never enjoy it. The address was short, and she did not repeat it. But it was translated into 47 languages and broadcast across a large portion of the known galaxy within the week, because everyone wanted to understand what had just happened. And this seemed like the clearest explanation available. On the last morning before the main human fleet began its first rotation home, Thesavara walked out to the edge of the field, where the aid stations had been set up. Most of them were still running, though the emergency phase was over, and things were moving into the slower work of real recovery. A group of Velthari children had gathered near one of the human troop transports, watching the soldiers prepare to load equipment. The soldiers let them watch. A few of them talked to the children, answering questions with the patient, slightly awkward kindness of people who were not sure exactly how to talk to small aliens, but were determined to try. One soldier was sitting on a supply crate, and a small girl had walked up to him and was looking up at him with the direct, fearless curiosity that very young children have before the world teaches them to be careful. He was tall and broad, his armor thick and dark, a helmet resting on the crate beside him. Without the